Everyone admired David Adeyemi. By the time he was 35, he had built what most people called a dream life. He owned a thriving digital agency in Lagos, Nigeria, had 15 employees, big clients, and a sleek office in Lekki. He hadn't prayed in months. He barely slept. His relationships were crumbling, and his smile was a mask worn to keep up appearances. His name showed up on business blogs, award lists, and investor panels. People envied his rise, but few knew the cost. Behind the scenes, David was drowning, spiritually dry, emotionally numb, and physically exhausted, until it all came crashing down. This is the story of how David's biggest failure became God's greatest turning point in his life. It started small. A late payment here, a missed deadline there. Then, a scandal with a client he had trusted completely. An overseas deal fell through, and David lost nearly 18 million Nigerian nairas overnight. With staff salaries pending and vendors breathing down his neck, he tried to patch the sinking ship. His former clients. He spent days scrolling through job boards and nights fighting back tears. A court order had been issued due to unpaid debt. That evening, his landlord gave him a 30-day notice to vacate. Not emails or business proposals, but his thoughts, his pain, and his prayers. But the more he patched, the more it leaked. And are called according to his purpose, David asked the question he had avoided for months. David started small. One Friday afternoon, the bank called. His business account was frozen. He had lost everything in 3 weeks. And for the first time in years, David sat alone on the floor of his now empty office and whispered, "God, are you still there?" The silence that followed wasn't divine. It was deafening. No business, no income, no dignity. David moved back in with his mother in Ajaja, something he never imagined he'd do as a grown man. He couldn't face his friends, his church. One day, while organizing old boxes, he stumbled upon a journal he kept during university. What began as 5 people turned into 50. Soon, a church offered their hall. Then a local NGO sponsored lunch for attendees. Inside were pages of dreams. Dreams of starting a mentoring program for boys, writing books, teaching young entrepreneurs. He chuckled bitterly. "What a joke," he muttered. But the idea refused to go away. But he was rich in a different way now. His days were filled with meaning. He taught workshops. He counseled business owners. He even began rebuilding relationships he had lost during his climb to success. With nowhere else to turn, David began to write. Within 6 months, David's first book, Failing Forward with Faith, was released and sold over 10,000 copies. He's a husband, a father, a man full of laughter, peace, and scars that have become testimonies. Slowly, something shifted. He wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. For the first time in years, he was real, with himself and with God. Success would have blinded me. Failure introduced me to purpose. One morning, after reading Romans 8 verse 28, all things work together for good for those who love God. What if the failure wasn't a punishment, but a reset? With an old laptop and 0 Nigerian nairas, he launched a blog titled Lessons from Losing It All. He shared stories, not just business lessons, but spiritual insights. He talked about failure, depression, pride, and God's quiet presence in dark places. And because God was never trying to build a company, he was building a man. The blog got 100 views, then 500, then 10,000. Emails started pouring in from young men, struggling entrepreneurs, and people who had lost hope. One message read, "I was about to give up on life until I read your post. Thank you." Tears filled David's eyes. Maybe, just maybe, this was his calling. With encouragement from readers, David started hosting small group sessions at his local community hall, free mentoring for young adults. He didn't have a business anymore, but he had purpose. And ironically, that purpose began to open doors he never expected. A publisher reached out after reading his blog. David didn't become wealthy again overnight. Then one day, he received an unexpected call. An international Christian leadership organization wanted him to speak at a conference in Kenya. His blog had reached one of their directors. They believed his story could empower thousands. David stood on that stage weeks later, looking at the sea of faces before him. He took a deep breath and said, "My business failed. My pride was crushed. My image was shattered. But what I thought was the end was God's beginning." Sometimes, God lets what you build fall because He wants to rebuild you first. The audience stood in applause, many in tears. Years later, David now runs the Resilience Academy, a nonprofit that trains and mentors thousands of youth across Africa. People often ask him, "Do you ever wish your first business had succeeded?" He smiles and answers, "If it had, I wouldn't have discovered who I really was. I thank God it failed, because it was never meant to define me. It was meant to refine me." We often see failure as the end, but sometimes failure is the chisel in God's hand, carving out pride, illusion, and false security. David's business had to fail first because his soul needed saving, because his calling was louder than his career, because the people he now inspires would never have found him if his empire hadn't fallen. Have you failed recently? Lost something you thought you couldn't live without? Maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's the beginning. Your loss doesn't disqualify you. Your story isn't over. God just might be preparing you for something far greater than you imagined. Like this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Share this video with someone who feels like a failure. Remember, sometimes your plan has to fail, so God's plan can succeed.